The cold, polished marble of the lobby floor seemed to stretch into an infinite, mocking gleam under the recessed lighting. It was a space designed to diminish, to make one feel small before the sheer scale of the wealth it represented. And for Ethan Vance, it was working exactly as his architects had intended. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He stood beside Chloe Davenport, the woman who, for the past 6 months, he had allowed to believe he was a man struggling to keep pace with her world. She gestured expansively with a perfectly manicured hand, her diamond bracelet catching the light and scattering it like fractured stars. "Look at this place, Ethan," she said, her voice a mixture of awe and something else, a subtle, condescending pity directed at him. "This is the azure, the absolute pinnacle. This is where the real players live." She turned to him, her gaze sweeping over his simple, well-made but unbranded wool coat. "This is a different league. My father's firm has a satellite office on the 40th floor, you know. He says you can feel the power in the air here." Ethan said nothing. He simply slid his hand into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of a single, heavy keycard. It was black, featureless, save for a small, embossed silver A, the master key. Chloe misread his silence as intimidation. A small, tight smile played on her lips. "I know it's a lot to take in," she continued, her tone softening into the kind of gentle condescension one might use on a child. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed, but I wanted you to see it, to understand what I'm talking about when I say I have certain standards, aspirations." She then delivered the line that would echo in the silent chambers of his memory for years to come. "We've had fun, Ethan, really, but you have to see it, don't you? We're just not in the same league." She thought he was a mid-level financial analyst, barely making ends meet in a city that devoured such men for sport. She didn't know that every inch of the polished marble she stood on, every pane of glass that soared 70 stories into the sky, every silent elevator and hidden security system belonged to him. Within a week, in the penthouse of this very building, she and her entire family would be reminded that leagues are not determined by what you show, but by what you can prove. I hope this story is already grabbing you. We've all felt underestimated at some point, haven't we? If you're ready to see how this plays out, do me a favor and tap that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to how it all began. 6 months earlier, their meeting had been deceptively simple. A meet-cute in a world that was supposed to be free of such contrivances. It was at a small, independent coffee shop, the kind with distressed wood tables and the rich, overwhelming scent of freshly ground beans. Ethan was there not for the aesthetic, but because they were a tenant in one of his smaller commercial properties, and he liked to check in on his businesses personally, albeit anonymously. He was sketching in a notebook, not doodles, but architectural refinements for a community project he was funding. He was dressed in his usual off-duty uniform, jeans, a simple gray sweater, and worn leather boots. He cultivated an image of comfortable anonymity. It was his shield and his observation deck. Chloe had swept in like a miniature, fashionable hurricane, talking loudly into her phone about some brunch catastrophe. She was undeniably striking. A cascade of blonde hair, a face of sharp, beautiful angles, and an energy that demanded attention. When she'd ended her call with an exasperated sigh, she turned and found him looking. He hadn't meant to stare, but her sheer force of presence was captivating. "Can I help you?" she'd asked, her tone sharp, defensive. Ethan had simply smiled, a slow, disarming smile that had, on occasion, calmed much more hostile boardrooms. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm and even. "I was just admiring your negotiation skills. That brunch didn't stand a chance." The unexpected compliment disarmed her. The hardness in her eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. A laugh escaped her, genuine and surprisingly warm. You have no idea. The incompetence is staggering. She looked at his notebook. What are you drawing? Just ideas, he'd replied, closing it. He learned long ago that revealing his work invited questions he preferred not to answer. I'm Ethan. Chloe, she said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm, confident. So, what do you do when you're not critiquing the brunch-related meltdowns of strangers? Here was the first test, the first divergence in the path. He could have told her the truth. I'm an architect and a developer. I build things. I own things. But he saw the designer handbag slung over her shoulder, the subtle but expensive watch on her wrist, the faint air of someone who evaluated the world through a lens of material value. And a quiet, uncharacteristic experiment began to form in his mind. He was weary of the assumptions that came with his wealth, the instant shift in people's behavior when they learned his net worth. He wanted, just once, to be seen for himself. I'm a financial analyst, he said. The lie was simple, plausible. It was a role he understood well enough to discuss, a profession that was respectable but not remarkable, placing him squarely in the vast, hard-working middle. I work for a small firm downtown. Lots of spreadsheets, not nearly as exciting as brunch negotiations. Her interest didn't wane, but it did subtly recalibrate. He could almost see the mental calculation. Financial analyst, not a CEO, not a partner, but stable, potential. Well, she'd said, a new calculated warmth in her voice, spreadsheets can be sexy. Their first few dates were a whirlwind. Chloe was charming, witty, and dazzling. She loved grand gestures and public displays, steering them toward the city's most exclusive restaurants and rooftop bars. Ethan paid, of course, using a personal credit card with a modest limit, sometimes having to discreetly use a second card when she ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the list. He saw it as a research expense. He was studying her and the culture she embodied. He found himself genuinely drawn to her confidence, her unapologetic ambition. He hoped, beneath the glossy, status-obsessed exterior, there was a core of something real and substantial. The first crack in the facade appeared about a month in. He had picked her up for a gallery opening. He drove a reliable but unremarkable sedan, a 5-year-old model he kept for its sheer inconspicuousness. As he pulled up to her luxury apartment building, a place he knew well, as he'd been outbid for it 3 years prior, the doorman gave his car a look of profound disdain. Chloe slid into the passenger seat, her perfume filling the clean but simple interior. "This is your car?" she asked, her nose wrinkling slightly as she ran a hand over the fabric seat. "It gets me from A to B," Ethan said, his tone light, betraying none of the internal disappointment he felt. "It's just, I'm used to leather," she said with a little laugh, as if sharing a cute, quirky flaw. "And a driver, honestly. Daddy spoils me." She patted his arm. "Don't worry, it's kind of quaint." Quaint. The word hung in the air between them. It was the first of many such words. His apartment, a clean, spacious, but modestly furnished one-bedroom he kept for exactly these purposes, was cozy. His preference for quiet neighborhood restaurants over celebrity chef hotspots was endearing. His lack of interest in brand names and luxury labels was sweetly old-fashioned. Each word was a small, polite paper cut. He was an amusing diversion, a palate cleanser between the richer, more complex courses she expected from life. He knew he should have ended it then. The experiment was yielding clear results. But a part of him, the part that had been lonely for longer than he cared to admit, held out hope. He wanted to believe that her fascination with status was a product of her upbringing, a shell that could be cracked open to reveal the warm, funny woman he'd first met in the coffee shop. He wanted to believe that she could, eventually, see him instead of his perceived financial bracket. It was a foolish hope, and he knew it, but he let it live, just a little longer. The price of that hope, he would soon discover, was his dignity. And the stage for that lesson would be her parents' house. The invitation to Sunday dinner at the Davenport estate was presented not as a request, but as a summons. Chloe announced it with an air of theatrical gravity. "My parents want to meet you," she'd said, as if she were bestowing upon him a rare and coveted honor. "This is a big deal, Ethan, so please try to make a good impression." The implication was clear. His current state was not impressive enough. She took him shopping the day before. It was a humiliating ordeal. She steered him through a high-end department store, holding up shirts and jackets, her expression a mixture of strained patience and clinical assessment. "No, not that one. The cut is all wrong for you," she'd say, snatching a cashmere sweater from his hands. "This one. The color will at least make you look a bit more prosperous." He bought the clothes she selected, paying with the same modest credit card. He felt like an actor being fitted for a costume in a play he had no desire to be in. The clothes felt foreign on his skin, a scratchy, ill-fitting disguise. He was Ethan Vance, a man who could buy the entire department store with a single phone call, being dressed up like a doll by a woman who thought he couldn't afford a decent suit. The dramatic irony was so thick he felt he could choke on it. The Davenport estate was less a home and more a monument to wealth. A long, winding driveway cut through acres of manicured lawn, leading to a sprawling stone mansion that looked like it had been airlifted from the English countryside. As Ethan parked his quaint sedan between a gleaming black Bentley and a cherry-red Porsche, he felt a familiar sense of detachment. He had designed homes like this. He knew their secrets, the hidden costs, the structural compromises, the constant draining upkeep required to maintain such a facade of effortless grandeur. Richard and Eleanor Davenport were exactly as he had pictured them. Richard was a tall man who had gone soft in the middle, with a florid face and a handshake that was less a greeting and more a test of strength. He sized Ethan up with a single, sweeping glance, his eyes lingering for a moment on the new, Chloe-approved blazer before dismissing him entirely. Eleanor was thin, elegant, and silent. She moved with a brittle grace, her smile a fixed, painted-on thing that never reached her eyes. She was the silent enabler, a woman who had long ago traded her own voice for a life of curated luxury. Dinner was a masterclass in subtle condescension. The dining room was cavernous, dominated by a long mahogany table polished to a mirror shine. Ethan sat silently as Richard held court, boasting about a recent acquisition, name-dropping politicians and CEOs, and complaining about the dreadful state of the modern work ethic. Every so often he would direct a question at Ethan, his tone dripping with paternalistic amusement. "Chloe tells me you're an analyst, Ethan," Richard said, pausing to take a loud sip of his wine. "Crunching the numbers, eh? Important work. Someone's got to do it." "It has its moments," Ethan replied, his voice even. He met Richard's gaze without flinching. I'm sure it does," Richard said, waving a dismissive hand. "But what's your ambition, son? What's the 5-year plan? You're not going to be crunching numbers forever, are you?" Before Ethan could answer, Chloe jumped in, her voice bright and falsely cheerful. "Oh, Daddy, don't interrogate him. Ethan is very methodical. He likes stability." She placed a hand on Ethan's arm, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate, but felt possessive, proprietary. She was managing him, presenting him in the least threatening light possible. The true humiliation, however, was saved for after dinner. Richard led Ethan into his study, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of leather and old money. He gestured for Ethan to sit in a small, uncomfortable chair while he settled into the throne-like seat behind his massive desk. "Listen, Ethan," Richard began, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. "I like you. You seem like a decent fellow, and you make my daughter happy, for now." He paused, letting the final 2 words hang in the air. "But I'm a practical man. Chloe is used to a certain lifestyle, a lifestyle you, and let's be blunt here, cannot provide." Ethan remained silent. His heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. He felt a strange sense of calm, the calm of a strategist watching his opponent move his pieces exactly as predicted. In his jacket pocket, his fingers found the slim leather portfolio he'd brought with him. He hadn't intended to use it, but he'd brought it out of instinct. A soldier always brings his weapon to the battlefield. "She's a brilliant girl, my Chloe," Richard continued, blind to Ethan's composure. "But she's got expensive tastes, always has, and I won't see her future compromised. I won't have her settling." "I have no intention of letting her settle," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. Richard chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of pure condescension. "Of course not, but intention doesn't pay for couture, my boy. It doesn't secure a table at the right restaurants or a penthouse with a view." He leaned back, a magnanimous smile spreading across his face. "So, I have a proposition for you, a way to give you a leg up. I have a position opening in my company, in the mailroom." The mailroom. The words landed in the silent room with a soft, dull thud. "It's a starting point," Richard said, clearly pleased with his own generosity. "You'd be sorting mail, making deliveries within the building. It's honest work, and it would put you in a corporate environment, show you how the big boys operate. More importantly, it would show me that you're serious, that you're willing to do what it takes to be worthy of my daughter." He was offering him a job that paid less than the property taxes on Ethan's smallest building. He was offering him a chance to be worthy of a woman who was living in a world Ethan himself had built and sold. Ethan looked at Richard Davenport, a man so insulated by his own perceived importance that he couldn't recognize the predator he was attempting to patronize. He saw the self-satisfied gleam in the older man's eyes, the utter confidence in his own judgment. And in that moment, Ethan's experiment in anonymity came to a screeching halt. This was no longer about hoping to find a genuine connection. This was about justice. He thought of the portfolio in his pocket. Inside was the final prospectus for the Azure, the 70-story monument to his vision, his work, his success. The building where Richard Davenport's firm was merely a tenant, paying exorbitant rent for the privilege of having an office on the 40th floor. Ethan stood up. He looked Richard squarely in the eye, and for the first time that evening, he allowed a fraction of his true self to show. A cold, hard glint of steel. "Thank you for the offer, Richard," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I'll give it the consideration it deserves." As he walked out of the study, leaving Richard looking momentarily confused by his sudden shift in demeanor, he passed Eleanor in the hall. She gave him a brief, pitying smile, and Chloe, waiting by the door, grabbed his arm. "What did he say? Did he like you? Did he offer you a job?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Yes," Ethan said, looking down at her. "He offered me a job." He didn't elaborate. He let her imagine a junior executive role, a path to the life she so desperately craved. He let her believe her father had seen his potential. He would allow her this small, false victory. The fall, he knew, would be that much greater when it finally came. The foundation for the great reversal was now set, laid on a bedrock of arrogance and disrespect. The quiet storm was gathering. The week after the disastrous dinner was a study in contrasts. Outwardly, Ethan maintained the same calm, unassuming demeanor. He went to his modest office, a small, rented space he used as a front, and answered Chloe's calls, listening to her excited chatter about the opportunity her father had given him. She was convinced that Richard was grooming him, that the mailroom was just a formality, a test of character before he was elevated to a position more befitting her boyfriend. "You see," she'd said over the phone, her voice bright with triumph, "Daddy sees your potential. You just needed someone to open the door for you. You have to start at the bottom and work your way up. That's how it's done." He would murmur non-committal agreements, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. Each conversation was another small cut, another drop of fuel on the slow-burning fire of his resolve. While Chloe was busy planning his imagined ascent up her father's corporate ladder, Ethan was engaged in a very different kind of planning. His real work took place at night, in the sprawling, minimalist apartment he actually called home. It was a penthouse in a different building, one of his earlier projects, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city he had helped to shape. Here, surrounded by blueprints, financial projections, and legal documents, the meek financial analyst vanished, replaced by the real Ethan Vance, a meticulous, driven, and quietly ruthless strategist. He spent hours with Marcus Harrison, his sharp-witted and fiercely loyal lawyer. They sat at a massive glass table, the city lights twinkling below them like a conquered kingdom. The mailroom, Marcus had repeated, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face when Ethan recounted the offer. "Richard Davenport offered you a job in the mailroom?" He let out a low whistle. The man's arrogance is breathtaking. He has no idea his company's lease renewal for the Azure office is on your desk, does he? "None at all," Ethan confirmed, his gaze fixed on the document in question. It was a thick stack of papers, detailing the terms of the 5-year lease for the 40th and 41st floors of the Azure. Davenport's firm, Davenport and Stern, paid a premium for that space, a fact Richard often boasted about as a sign of his success. The lease was due for renewal in 2 months, and the signatory for the building's ownership company was, of course, Ethan. And he has no idea that Davenport and Stern's primary lender, Sterling Capital, was acquired by your holding company 6 months ago? Marcus continued, tapping a different file. "He just sees the same bank name," Ethan said. "He doesn't bother with the details of who owns the bank. He just knows his credit line is secure. For now." "This is beautiful, Ethan. It's a corporate siege in 3 acts, Marcus said, his eyes gleaming. "The landlord, the lender. What's the third?" Ethan slid a thin folder across the table. It was labeled Project Phoenix. It contained the architectural plans and acquisition proposal for the very building that housed Davenport and Stern's headquarters. The building's owners were in quiet financial distress, and Ethan's firm had been in secret negotiations to buy it for weeks. Marcus opened the folder and let out a soft laugh. "You're not just going to terminate his lease. You're going to become his landlord at his main office too, and you already own his debt. Ethan, this isn't a chess match. You've surrounded his king with 3 queens while he's still figuring out how to move his pawns." "He drew the map," Ethan said, his voice cold. "He and his daughter. They believe the world is divided into leagues. They believe worth is measured by a brand name on a suit or the size of a car. I'm simply going to provide them with a more accurate form of measurement." The humiliation, however, was not yet complete. The universe, it seemed, demanded one final act of condescension before the scales could be balanced. Chloe, buoyed by the belief that Ethan was on the verge of becoming acceptable, decided it was time he saw what he should be aspiring to. She called him, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I have a surprise for you," she announced. "Clear your Saturday. We're going on a tour." "A tour of what?" Ethan asked, already sensing the trap. "The Azure," she squealed. "The penthouse. I pulled some strings with my father's contact. It's not actually on the market. It's the developer's private residence, but he's out of the country, so we can get a private look. I want you to see it, Ethan. I want you to see what we could have one day, if you work hard and play your cards right." The developer's private residence. His private residence. She had, through some mid-level building manager her father knew, arranged a tour of his own home. The absurdity was so profound it was almost sublime. He could have shut it down with a single word. He could have told her the truth right then. But the image of Richard Davenport offering him a job in a mailroom was still burned into his mind. No, the lesson needed to be delivered in person. It needed an audience. "That sounds aspirational," Ethan said, choosing his word carefully. "Exactly. I want to inspire you," she said, completely missing the irony. My parents are going to meet us there. They're curious to see it too. It will be fun, like a little family outing. A family outing. The stage was being set, and the actors were all assembling, blissfully unaware of the script's final, shocking twist. The quiet before the storm was descending. The Saturday of the tour dawned bright and clear, the sky a crisp, brilliant blue. It was the kind of day that made the city look like a promise, a place where anything was possible. For Ethan, it felt like the calm, deep breath before a plunge into icy water. He dressed with meticulous care, not in the expensive costume Chloe had chosen for him, but in his own clothes. A simple, dark gray turtleneck sweater made of soft merino wool, tailored black trousers, and the same worn leather boots. It was the outfit of a man comfortable in his own skin, a man who had nothing to prove. When he arrived at Chloe's apartment building, the doorman gave him the now familiar look of disdain. Chloe was waiting in the lobby, tapping her foot impatiently. She took one look at his outfit and her face fell. "Ethan, what are you wearing?" she asked, her voice a sharp, frustrated whisper. "I told you this was important. You look like you're going for a walk in the park." "These are my clothes, Chloe," he said calmly. "I bought you that beautiful blazer. You were supposed to look professional, impressive." She let out an exasperated sigh and started fussing with his collar, as if that could somehow transform him. "Fine, it's too late now. Just try to stay in the background. Let my father do the talking." The drive to the Azure was a masterclass in psychological warfare, with Chloe as the oblivious aggressor. She chattered endlessly about the building, quoting statistics she'd clearly memorized from a brochure. "It has a private cinema, a Michelin-starred restaurant for residents only, and the infinity pool on the 60th floor has salt water imported from the Maldives. Can you even imagine?" Ethan said nothing, his hands steady on the wheel of his quaint sedan. He imagined it perfectly. He had signed the purchase orders. "When you start at Daddy's company," she continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality, "we'll have to start saving, seriously saving. Maybe in 10 or 15 years we could afford a one-bedroom in a building like this. Not this one, obviously, but something similar." 15 years. He could feel the leather portfolio on the seat beside him, a silent, heavy rebuttal to her every word. He was done feeling frustrated. The anger had cooled and hardened into something else, a profound, crystalline clarity. He was not just seeking justice for himself anymore. He was a force of correction, a response to an imbalance in the universe. He was about to hold up a mirror to the Davenports, and they would not like the reflection. They were the first to arrive. He parked his car in the underground garage, deliberately choosing a spot far from the gleaming phalanx of luxury vehicles. As they walked toward the private elevators, Chloe clutched his arm, her excitement palpable. "My heart is racing. Can you believe we're actually doing this?" "It's just a building, Chloe," he said, his voice low. "Don't be silly," she snapped, her nerves making her sharp. "It's not just a building. It's a statement. It's proof that you've made it." They rode the private elevator in silence. It was a high-speed, whisper-quiet machine that ascended the 70 floors in under a minute. The interior was paneled in the same dark, polished wood as Richard Davenport's study, a small, deliberate architectural echo Ethan had designed himself. As the doors slid open, they stepped not into a hallway, but directly into the penthouse itself. The effect was exactly as he had planned. The entire west-facing wall was a single, seamless sheet of glass, revealing a breathtaking, godlike view of the city and the river beyond. The afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the vast, open-plan space. The floors were wide planks of pale oak. The furniture was minimal, elegant, and brutally expensive, pieces he had personally selected from designers in Milan and Stockholm. It was a space that spoke not of clutter or ostentatious display, but of pure, confident, and absolute power. Chloe was speechless. She walked almost in a daze toward the great glass wall, her hand outstretched as if to touch the sky. My God, she whispered. It's perfect. Ethan walked to the center of the room and placed his leather portfolio on a massive, low-slung marble coffee table. He felt a sense of profound calm settle over him. He was home. A moment later, the elevator chimed again, and Richard and Eleanor Davenport stepped out. Richard was flushed, his chest puffed out, already performing the role of the man who belonged in such spaces. Eleanor was, as ever, a silent, impeccably dressed accessory. "Well, well," Richard boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Quite the place. Have to hand it to the developer. He didn't cut any corners." He clapped Ethan on the shoulder, a gesture of patronizing bonhomie. "See this, Ethan? This is what ambition gets you. Take a good look. Drink it all in. This is the goal." Chloe, recovering from her initial awe, drifted back to Ethan's side. She linked her arm through his, pulling him closer to her parents. It was a gesture of ownership, of presenting her project. "Isn't it amazing? I wanted Ethan to see what he should be working towards." Eleanor gave Ethan another one of her pitying smiles. "It's important to have dreams, dear," she said, her voice thin as tissue paper. Richard then turned his full attention to Ethan. The time for pleasantries was over. This was a continuation of the interrogation from his study. "So, Ethan," he said, his tones shifting, becoming more serious, "have you given any more thought to my offer? The position in the mailroom?" He said the word mailroom loudly, ensuring everyone heard it, framing it as a test of Ethan's humility and desire. Chloe's grip on Ethan's arm tightened. Her face was a mask of strained encouragement. "Say yes," her eyes pleaded. "Show him you're willing." This was it, the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate humiliation, delivered in the heart of his own sanctuary, in front of the woman he had once cared for and her family. The quiet storm was about to break. Ethan gently disengaged his arm from Chloe's grasp. He turned to face Richard, a small, unreadable smile on his lips. "I have, Richard," he said, his voice calm and measured, yet carrying a new weight that made everyone in the room unconsciously straighten up. "I've given it a great deal of thought." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension build. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the oak floor. The city below was beginning to glitter with evening lights. "Your offer was very illuminating," Ethan continued, his gaze steady. "It taught me a lot about you, about your values, about how you see the world." Richard's face clouded over. This was not the grateful, cap-in-hand response he had expected. "And what's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice losing some of its bluster. Ethan took a step toward the marble coffee table and rested a hand on his leather portfolio. The symbolic object, the repository of his hidden power. "It means," Ethan said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming quieter but somehow more powerful, "that I am forced to decline your offer." He looked from Richard to Eleanor, and finally to Chloe, whose face was now a canvas of confusion and dawning apprehension. "You see," he said, his smile vanishing, replaced by an expression of cold, hard clarity, "I have a standing policy against taking jobs for which I am profoundly, unequivocally overqualified." The quiet bomb had been dropped. The fuse was lit. The great reversal had begun. The silence that followed Ethan's statement was a physical presence in the room. It was heavier than the marble table, more vast than the panoramic view. Richard Davenport's jovial, condescending mask crumbled, replaced by a look of slack-jawed disbelief. Eleanor's painted-on smile froze and then fractured, and Chloe just stared at him, her blue eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly souring into anger. "What did you just say?" Richard finally managed to sputter, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Overqualified? For a position I generously created for you? Do you have any idea how arrogant you sound?" "Arrogance is a matter of perspective, Richard," Ethan replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. His quiet confidence was more commanding than any shout. For example, some might consider it arrogant to offer a man a mailroom job in a building where you are merely a tenant. He let that sentence land. He watched as the gears turned slowly in their minds, the implication too outlandish for them to immediately grasp. Chloe was the first to react, with a short, sharp, disbelieving laugh. "A tenant? What are you talking about, Ethan? My father's firm is a major name. They have 2 floors here." She turned to her father, looking for confirmation, for a dismissal of this absurdity. "He's right, Chloe," Ethan said, his gaze locked on Richard. "Davenport and Stern leases the 40th and 41st floors. A 5-year lease, if I recall. The renewal for which is coming up in 63 days. He paused. "It's a very detailed document. I was reviewing it just last night." Richard's eyes narrowed. The confusion was now tinged with a specific, corporate kind of fear. This was not the language of a mid-level analyst. This was the language of someone who read leases, someone who held power. "How would you know that?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Ethan walked slowly over to the great glass wall, standing with his back to the room, looking out over the city. His city. "I know it because I'm the one who will be signing it, or more accurately, the one who will be declining to renew it." He turned back to face them. The afternoon sun haloed his silhouette, making it impossible for them to read his expression clearly. He was a figure of judgment, silhouetted against a backdrop of his own creation. "You can't be serious," Chloe whispered. The words were a plea. Her reality was beginning to warp, to twist into a shape she could not recognize. "Ethan, stop this. This isn't funny. You're embarrassing me in front of my parents." "Embarrassment," Ethan said, taking a step back toward the coffee table. "Let's talk about embarrassment, Chloe." He began to catalog the grievances, his voice a steady, relentless metronome of truth. "Is it embarrassing to be told your car is quaint? To have your apartment called cozy with a pitying smile? Is it embarrassing to be dressed by your girlfriend like a child before meeting her parents so you can look prosperous enough for them?" He looked at Richard. "Is it embarrassing to be lectured on ambition by a man who then offers you a job sorting his mail as a test of your worthiness?" He looked at Eleanor. "Or is it most embarrassing to stand by silently with a polite, vacant smile while the people you claim to love systematically dismantle a man's dignity?" Each question was a stone dropped into the silent pool of their arrogance. The ripples were spreading, touching each of them. Eleanor flinched as if struck. Richard's face was a thundercloud of rage and confusion. Chloe's face had gone pale, her lipstick a garish slash of red against her white skin. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" It was the question he had been waiting for, the question the entire charade had been built to provoke. Ethan reached down and picked up the black leather portfolio from the coffee table. He held it not as a weapon, but as a simple fact. He unzipped it slowly, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He reached inside and pulled out a single, thick sheet of paper. It was a deed. He then pulled out the black, featureless key card he'd had in his pocket in the lobby, the master key. He placed them both on the marble table, the deed with its official seals and bold, damning print, and the key card. "My name is Ethan Vance," he said, his voice clear and final. "I am an architect and a developer. I am the principal owner of Vance Sterling Holdings, the company that financed, designed, and built the Azure." He paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle. "This penthouse we're standing in? It's my home. The developer who is out of the country?" He gave a small, humorless smile. "I'm afraid he came back early." The world tilted on its axis. Chloe stared at the deed on the table, then back at Ethan's face, as if trying to reconcile two completely different images. The humble analyst and the master of this universe. The man she thought she was elevating, and the man who stood on a peak so high he couldn't even see her world. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. Richard took a clumsy step forward and peered at the document. He saw the name Vance Sterling Holdings. He saw the signatory line. He saw Ethan's name. His corporate brain, trained to recognize threats and opportunities, finally processed the information. The blood drained from his face. Vance Sterling Holdings. The name clicked into place with an audible mental clang. The quiet acquisition of his primary lender, Sterling Capital. The rumors of a new, aggressive player in the city's real estate market. The mysterious developer behind the Azure, a man so private no photos of him were publicly available. It was all him. It was Ethan, the man he'd offered a job in the mailroom. "Oh my God," Richard whispered, stumbling back. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. He was speaking to the abyss that had just opened up beneath his feet. He was the landlord. He was the lender. Ethan wasn't finished. He looked at Chloe, whose eyes were now filling with tears of shock and dawning, desperate horror. "You said we weren't in the same league, Chloe," he said, his voice softer now, but no less devastating. "You were right. I'm sorry it took me this long to agree with you." The quiet bomb had detonated. The fallout was just beginning to rain down. The immediate aftermath of the revelation was a symphony of stunned silence and frantic, disjointed thought. The air in the penthouse grew thick and heavy, each character trapped in their own private whirlwind of shock. For Ethan, it was a moment of strange, hollow victory. He had wanted this, planned for it, but the reality of their shattered faces brought him no joy, only a grim sense of necessity. He was a surgeon who had just completed a radical, painful, but necessary amputation. Chloe was the first to break the spell. The tears that had welled in her eyes finally spilled over, tracing clean paths through her expensive foundation. It wasn't a cry of sadness or remorse, but of pure, unadulterated panic. The world as she knew it, a carefully constructed hierarchy of status and wealth, had been inverted. The man she had deemed unworthy was, in fact, the king of the very castle she aspired to enter. "Ethan, I don't," she stammered, taking a step toward him, her hand outstretched in a gesture of pleading. "I didn't know. How could I have known? You lied to me." The accusation, so baldly absurd in its context, hung in the air. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "I didn't lie, Chloe. I simply omitted. I presented myself as a man, not a balance sheet. I wanted to see if that would be enough. The results of that experiment are conclusive." But this changes everything," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate, shrill edge. "Don't you see? This is wonderful. You and me, we can have all of this." She gestured wildly around the room, at the priceless view, the designer furniture. She was trying to reassimilate him into her worldview, to upgrade his status from charity project to grand prize. Her mind was scrambling to salvage the situation, to rewrite the narrative so that she was still the protagonist. "There is no we, Chloe," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm as granite. "There can't be. You weren't interested in a partnership with Ethan Vance, the man. You were interested in the potential for him to one day afford a lifestyle you felt you deserved. The irony is, the man you dismissed already owned it all. You just couldn't see past the brand of his suit." While Chloe was grappling with the personal catastrophe, Richard Davenport was processing the professional one. His face, which had been pale with shock, was now slick with a cold sweat. He understood the implications far more quickly and deeply than his daughter. The lease, the loan, the very foundation of his business empire was suddenly resting in the hands of the man he had just mortally insulted. "Vance Sterling Holdings," Richard murmured, the name a curse on his lips. "You acquired Sterling Capital." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of dawning horror. 6 months ago, Ethan confirmed, "a quiet transaction. We've been reviewing all of their major accounts. Yours is particularly interesting." Richard's bluster was gone. replaced by the raw, naked fear of a man about to lose everything. "Look, Vance, Mr. Vance," he corrected himself, the shift in title a clear signal of surrender. "What happened before, it was a misunderstanding, a joke in poor taste. I was just testing you, son, seeing if you had grit." The pathetic attempt to reframe his insult as a test was so transparent that Ethan almost felt a flicker of pity for him. "Almost. A test?" Ethan repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Let me be clear, Richard. You failed. You, your wife, your daughter. You all failed a test of character, of basic human decency." Just then the private elevator chimed again. The sound made all three Davenports jump. The doors slid open to reveal the calm, imposing figure of Marcus Harrison. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He nodded once to Ethan, a silent acknowledgement, before his sharp gaze swept over the shattered family. He was the unexpected ally, arriving not with a sword, but with contracts. The executioner cloaked in legal precision. "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, his voice crisp and professional. "I trust I'm not interrupting." "You're right on time, Marcus," Ethan replied. "Mr. Davenport, his wife Eleanor, his daughter Chloe. This is my legal counsel, Marcus Harrison." Marcus gave them a thin, predatory smile. "A pleasure," he said, the words conveying the exact opposite sentiment. He walked to the marble coffee table and placed his briefcase next to Ethan's portfolio, clicking it open with two sharp snaps. "We have a few items to discuss." He pulled out a slim file folder. "First," he began, addressing Richard directly, "the lease for the 40th and 41st floors of this building. As Mr. Vance indicated, Vance Sterling Holdings will not be offering a renewal. You will be required to vacate the premises within 90 days of your current lease's expiration. That's 153 days from today. We trust that will be sufficient time to find a new, more suitable location for your operations." Richard looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. His prestigious Azure address was a cornerstone of his company's image. Losing it would be a public humiliation, a clear signal to the market that Davenport and Stern was in trouble. "You can't do that," Chloe cried out, her focus shifting from her personal loss to the threat against her family's status. "My father's company has been a loyal tenant." "Loyalty is a two-way street, Miss Davenport," Marcus said coolly, not even bothering to look at her. He pulled out a second, much thicker folder. "Second, the outstanding line of credit and various business loans held by Davenport and Stern with Sterling Capital, which, as you now know, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Vance Sterling Holdings." He opened the folder. "We have identified several covenants that are in technical, though not yet material, breach. Given the new information regarding our professional relationship, our risk assessment committee has decided to call in the full balance of these loans. Payment is due in full in 60 days. This was the kill shot. Richard staggered back and sank into one of the expensive minimalist armchairs, his face ashen. He knew his company's cash flow. He couldn't possibly liquidate enough assets to cover the full debt in 60 days without triggering a complete collapse. He was ruined. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He was no longer speaking to Ethan as a prospective son-in-law or a mailroom clerk. He was pleading with his executioner. "Please, Mr. Vance, Ethan, there must be another way. We can work something out." Ethan looked at the broken man, then at his weeping daughter, then at his silent, shell-shocked wife. He felt the weight of their collective future in his hands. He had wanted justice, and he had achieved it. The reversal of fortune was total and absolute. Those who had humiliated him were now pleading for mercy. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been annihilated and rebuilt from scratch. "There was another way, Richard," Ethan said, his voice resonating with the quiet finality of a closing door. "It was called respect. It was called kindness. It was a path you chose not to take." He turned to Chloe, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second, a final flicker of the man who had once hoped for more. "I truly am sorry it had to be this way, Chloe." Then he turned to Marcus. "I believe we are finished here." With a final nod, Ethan and Marcus turned and walked toward the private elevator, leaving the Davenport family alone in the vast, sun-drenched penthouse that was no longer a symbol of their aspiration, but a monument to their downfall. As the elevator doors slid shut, the last thing Ethan saw was Chloe's face, a mask of utter devastation, finally understanding the true meaning of being in a different league. The days that followed the confrontation in the penthouse were a blur of calculated, decisive action for Ethan and a spiral of frantic damage control for the Davenports. The consequences, once set in motion, unfolded with the inexorable logic of gravity. Ethan, guided by Marcus Harrison, proceeded not with vindictive glee, but with the cool, detached precision of a demolition expert dismantling a condemned structure. The goal was not to inflict needless cruelty, but to ensure a clean, final separation. Richard Davenport, in a desperate, last-ditch effort to save his company, tried to leverage public opinion. He leaked a carefully spun version of the story to a few friendly financial journalists, painting himself as the victim of a ruthless corporate raider, a wolf in sheep's clothing, who had used his daughter to gain proximity to his business. It was a foolish, desperate move. Marcus Harrison countered it with a single, devastatingly effective press release. It was a masterwork of corporate communication, stating only the verifiable facts. Vance Sterling Holdings had acquired Sterling Capital as part of a larger strategic investment. A standard review of all major accounts had been initiated. The decision not to renew Davenport and Stern's lease at the Azure was based on a strategic realignment of the property's tenant profile. The calling in of the loans was a prudent financial measure based on a reassessment of risk. There was no mention of Chloe, no mention of the mailroom, no mention of the personal betrayals. The statement was cold, professional, and utterly irrefutable. It made Richard's emotional, self-serving narrative look like the ravings of an unstable and unreliable businessman. The market agreed. Davenport and Stern's stock, already fragile, began to plummet. Chloe, meanwhile, attempted a different strategy, a campaign of personal appeals. She bombarded Ethan's phone with calls, texts, and long, rambling voicemails. They were a chaotic mix of apologies, accusations, and declarations of love. "Ethan, please, you have to talk to me," one voicemail began, her voice thick with tears. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I was shallow and stupid. It was how I was raised, but I can change. I love you, I really do. I love the man I met in the coffee shop, not the billionaire. We can go back to that." A few hours later, another message would arrive, this one laced with anger. "How could you do this to my family? You used me. You played this sick game, pretending to be someone you weren't, just to humiliate us. You're a monster, a cold-hearted snake." Then it would swing back to pleading. "Just give my father a chance. Give him more time. He'll pay you back every cent. Don't destroy him. Don't destroy us." Ethan listened to the first few messages, his expression unchanging. He felt a distant pang of pity for her. She was a product of her environment, a prisoner of the shallow values she had been taught since birth. But pity was not a foundation upon which to build a relationship, nor was it a reason to halt the course of justice. He instructed his assistant to block her number. He needed silence to move forward. The most telling communication came not from Chloe or Richard, but from Eleanor. A week after the confrontation, a handwritten letter arrived at his office. The envelope was made of thick, expensive, cream-colored paper, her penmanship elegant and precise. Ethan opened it, expecting another plea for mercy, but the contents were different. "Mr. Vance," it began, "I am writing to you not to ask for your forgiveness, as I do not believe I have earned it, nor to request your pity, as I am certain my family has exhausted it. I am writing to say that you were right. Your words in the penthouse that day were cruel, but they were also true. I have been a silent, smiling accomplice to the arrogance of my husband and the shallowness of my daughter for 30 years. I traded my voice for comfort, my integrity for security. I saw how they treated you. I saw the small, daily cruelties, and I did nothing. I cannot change what has been done. The consequences my husband now faces are of his own making. The heartbreak my daughter feels is a direct result of her own choices. But I can at last stop being silent. I have told my husband that I will not stand by him as he continues to lie and cast blame. I have told my daughter that her worth is not dependent on the man she is with or the price of her handbag. I doubt they have heard me. They have not had practice in listening to me. But I will continue to speak, if only for myself. You have taken my husband's company, but you have given me back my voice. It is a strange and terrible transaction. I do not thank you, but I do acknowledge the truth you forced me to see. Sincerely, Eleanor Davenport. Ethan read the letter twice. Of all the Davenports, she was the only one who seemed to understand. She was the only one who had looked in the moral mirror he had held up and had not flinched away from the reflection. He folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer. It was a small, unexpected flicker of hope in the wreckage. The 60-day deadline for the loan repayment approached. Richard, unable to secure new financing, as no bank would touch a company that was being actively dismantled by Van Sterling, was forced into a corner. 2 days before the deadline, Marcus Harrison arranged a final meeting. It took place not in Ethan's penthouse or a corporate boardroom, but in a neutral law office. Richard Davenport entered the room a changed man. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. The blustering arrogance was gone, replaced by the quiet, beaten demeanor of a defeated general. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Richard," Ethan replied, his tone neutral. "I can't pay," Richard said simply. "You know I can't. You've won. Take the company. It's yours." Ethan looked at the man across the table. He saw the ruin, the despair, and he made a choice. He had not set out to destroy Richard Davenport, only to correct him. The destruction was a byproduct of Richard's own hubris, but Ethan would not be the man who salted the earth of his defeated enemy. "I don't want your company, Richard," Ethan said, and Richard looked up, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "It's poorly managed, over-leveraged, and its primary assets are a brand name that is now synonymous with failure. It's worthless to me." He slid a new proposal, drafted by Marcus, across the table. "Here is my offer. You will resign as CEO of Davenport and Stern, effective immediately. You will turn over your entire controlling interest in the company to a trust. That trust will be managed by an independent board I appoint. Their goal will not be profit, but to stabilize the company and save as many jobs as possible. They will sell off assets to pay the debt to Sterling Capital over a period of 3 years, not 60 days. Richard stared at the document. It was a lifeline, but a brutal one. He would lose his company, his power, his identity, but the company itself and the hundreds of people it employed might survive. "And what do I get?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You get to avoid personal bankruptcy," Ethan said coldly. "You get to keep your house, and you get a generous severance package, conditional on your complete and total silence regarding this matter. You will retire. You will disappear. If you ever speak my name or my company's name in public again, this offer is void, and Marcus will personally oversee the liquidation of every last asset you own, down to your cufflinks. Is that clear?" Richard nodded slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had been stripped of his power, but not utterly destroyed. It was a form of justice that was both complete and merciful. He signed the papers without another word. The final loose end was Chloe. 2 weeks after her father's retirement was announced, Ethan received a message, forwarded by his assistant. It was from a new number. "Can we please talk? Just once. Not a call. In person. The coffee shop, where we met. I'll be there tomorrow at 3 p.m. If you don't come, I'll understand, and I'll never bother you again." Ethan considered ignoring it. There was nothing left to say, but the mention of the coffee shop, the place of their deceptively simple beginning, struck a chord within him. He needed to close the circle, not for her, but for himself. He arrived the next day at 3. The coffee shop was quiet, filled with the soft afternoon light and the familiar smell of roasted beans. Chloe was sitting at the same table where he'd first seen her. She looked different. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her makeup was minimal. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and profoundly tired. She looked up as he approached, and a sad, knowing smile touched her lips. "You came. You said it would be the last time," he said, remaining standing. "It will be," she said, her voice quiet. "I don't want to ask for anything. I needed to say I'm sorry. Not just for what I said or did, but for who I was. You were right. I never saw you. I was so busy looking for a label, a price tag, that I missed the person. And you were a good person, Ethan. You were kind and patient, and you deserve better than me." It was the first genuine, unconditional apology he had received from her. He could see in her eyes that she meant it. The shock had worn off, replaced by a hard, painful clarity. "My father is a broken man," she continued, looking down at her hands. "My mother has found her voice, which is a miracle I don't think he knows how to handle. She's talking about leaving him. Everything is falling apart, and it's all my fault. I was the one who pushed. I was the one who insisted on my standards." "It wasn't all your fault, Chloe," Ethan said, and for the first time he felt a genuine wave of sympathy. "You were all playing the same game. You just didn't know I owned the board." "What will you do now?" she asked, looking up at him. "I'll keep building things," he said simply, "and I'll try to be more honest about who I am from the beginning." "He's a good man, you know," she said suddenly. "The analyst you pretended to be. I think, if he were real, I might have actually fallen in love with him. Eventually." It was a sad, pathetic confession, a glimpse of a different path, a different life that could never be. Ethan nodded slowly. "I hope you find what you're looking for one day, Chloe." "I don't even know what that is anymore," she whispered. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her coffee and the ghosts of what might have been. As he stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, he felt a profound sense of release. The circle was closed. The lesson had been taught, and perhaps even learned. The scales were balanced, and he was free. Months melted into a year. The name Davenport and Stern faded from the financial pages, eventually re-emerging as a smaller, more stable consulting firm under new management. Richard and Eleanor Davenport divorced quietly. Eleanor, true to her word, had found her voice and used it to build a new, smaller, but more authentic life for herself. She volunteered at a local library, took art classes, and was by all accounts content. Richard lived in quiet, wealthy obscurity, a ghost in his own mansion, his power and influence a distant memory. Chloe disappeared from the city's social scene. Ethan heard through the grapevine that she had moved to the West Coast, taken a low-level job in a nonprofit organization, and was going by her mother's maiden name. She was, it seemed, starting over, far from the world of status and expectation that had so thoroughly broken her. Ethan hoped she would find some measure of peace. His anger toward her had long since faded, replaced by a detached, philosophical melancholy. She was a casualty of a culture he despised, a culture built on the flimsy foundations of appearance and wealth. Ethan, for his part, thrived, but the experience had changed him. He was still a private man, but he no longer hid his identity. He gave a rare interview to an architectural magazine, speaking passionately about his philosophy of building spaces that fostered community and connection, not just isolation and prestige. He put his name and considerable resources behind several major philanthropic projects: a new public library in a low-income neighborhood, a state-of-the-art pediatric wing for the city hospital, a scholarship fund for aspiring architects from underprivileged backgrounds. He still lived in the penthouse of the Azure, but the space felt different now. It was no longer just a monument to his success, but a home. He hosted small gatherings, not with the city's power brokers, but with artists, writers, and community leaders, people who were building things of a different, more lasting nature. One evening, he was standing by the great glass wall, looking out at the glittering expanse of the city, when Marcus Harrison came to stand beside him. They were celebrating the final payment from the Davenport and Stern Trust, a quiet end to a tumultuous chapter. "You know," Marcus said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "most men in your position would have crushed him, utterly, taken his house, his name, everything. Why did you let him off so easily?" Ethan watched the tiny lights of cars moving along the distant freeways. "Because destroying him would have made me like him," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It would have meant that the whole point was to prove I was stronger, richer, more powerful. And that was never the point." "What was the point then?" Marcus asked. "The point," Ethan said, turning away from the window, "was to prove that character is the one asset you can't buy, sell, or leverage. It's the only thing that has true, intrinsic value. They thought my worth was determined by my bank account. The lesson they needed to learn was that their worth was determined by their actions. I just created the circumstances for that lesson to be taught." He had maintained his moral high ground. He hadn't stooped to their level. He hadn't become cruel or vindictive. He had simply held up a mirror, and they had broken themselves against their own reflection. The victory was not in their downfall, but in his own unwavering integrity. It was a vindication that was clean, absolute, and deeply satisfying. The story of Ethan and the Davenports became a quiet legend in certain circles, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and at exclusive cocktail parties. It was a story about the danger of underestimation, about the vast difference between perceived status and actual power. But for Ethan, it was something more personal. It was a reminder that true strength isn't about the heights you can build, but about the foundations you build them on. And his foundation of integrity, patience, and a quiet belief in human decency had proven to be unbreakable. So, what do you think? Was the justice Ethan delivered too harsh, or was it perfectly proportional to the offense? It's a fascinating question about where the line is between justice and revenge. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We all face moments where we feel disrespected or undervalued, and stories like this give us a sense of vicarious triumph, a feeling that sometimes the universe does balance the scales. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this story as compelling as I did, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales of satisfying reversals and hard-earned redemption. Your support means the world and allows us to keep creating content that resonates. Until next time, remember to value people for who they are, not for what they appear to be. You never know who you're talking to.